Hello to all of my members and welcome to this extended 7 steps to successful watercolour painting using just 3 primary colours. I'm going to be painting a desert scene, something I've actually never painted before, so it's my first time doing that. And this tutorial is in response to the poll that I did on the Patreon membership a little while ago, where quite a few of you wanted to see a desert scene, and a lot of you lately have said how useful it is just to use a limited palette, so I'm just sticking to these 3 colours. So shall we get started? A photo link and a list of the materials, colours and alternatives can be found in the description below. So step 1 is to draw the picture. I recommend an HB pencil, nothing too soft or too hard. Too soft it gets a bit smudgy, too hard it can actually scratch the surface of the watercolour paper. And for those of you on the Patreon membership, you can find a link for the downloadable sketch in the description below. So I'm starting off painting the sand first of all. This is permanent yellow, but you could use cadmium yellow. I'm actually using my size 10 brush, and I've just put a pinch of red into that mixture. And now I'm putting a little bit of blue. It's gone a bit green, so I'm adding a little bit more of the yellow and adding a little bit more of the red. So I want an orangey colour, but I don't want it to be too brightly orange, so I'm actually using the blue to kind of calm the colour down a bit. So if you find it goes too green, add a bit more red. So once you've got a great big puddle of colour, wet all of your sand area with a large soft brush. Take your time when you're doing this because it will give you more time once you're painting. You don't want big puddles there, you want the water to soak into the paper, and it will just give you more time to paint wet in wet. A really good tip to stop your paint drying too quickly is keep loading it, sort of load your brush, paint a couple of strokes, load your brush, paint a couple of strokes. Don't let the brush run out of paint. Always keep reloading that brush. That way everything, all this sort of wetness on the paper stays consistent, so you don't get uneven patches of very wet paint, damp paint, and then paint that's drying. This way it stays wet for longer because you are continually loading your brush, and that's why it's important to make a big puddle before you start painting. I deliberately didn't use any masking fluid. I'm using a paper towel to lift off light areas here. And just to create a little bit of light. You can, and I do, use a little bit of white gouache later as well. I'm also using a clean damp brush to lift off some lights on the sand dunes there. So I rinse my brush, take the excess water off the brush, and then lift off some of the paint, and then repeat again, washing my brush out, wiping the excess off on a paper towel and lifting off again. It's just to create some soft lights on the sand dunes. Now I'm actually mixing up the same sort of colour here but slightly darker, adding a bit more blue and slightly creamier because this is going to be damp into wet, to create some soft shadows on the sand there using my size 10 brush. And to stop the brush from being too wet, I'm actually taking some of the excess paint off on the paper towel as well. So I'm mixing up a little bit more of a darker shade here, so using the red, the blue and the yellow, And so it's a little bit more red and blue now and less yellow to make a sort of almost a sort of a mid to dark brown, quite creamy paint. And I'm going to paint this damp into damp now. So the surface is dry, not dried off, but the sheen is still there, but it's not wet anymore. And the paint, and if your paint's too wet on your brush, take the excess off on the paper towel and apply it damp into damp. I'm lifting off some light here out on the top of the sand dunes, the sort of soft shapes of light at the top there, because I've obviously painted on my sort of more dark, creamier shadow colours there. They're all basically shapes at the end of the day. Don't worry if it's not exactly like the photograph. Just have your lights and darks there and just lift off if you want to as well. Remember to keep rinsing your brush, take the excess water off on your paper towel and then lift. And the brush sort of soaks up the paint that way. But you've got to keep rinsing so your brush doesn't get contaminated. And it's a really effective way of creating soft lights. What you don't want to do is introduce wet moisture into your painting because you will get back runs. What I'm doing here is using a clean damp brush again and just softening here this shadow area here so it blends in so it doesn't stand out this mark here, and doing the same here on the right hand side. So I've allowed my painting to dry and I'm mixing up a puddle here of blue for the sky. I have cheated slightly. I've put a little bit of phthalo turquoise in there as well just to brighten up the blue, but you can stick with your ultramarine. And I'm wetting the sky area now with my large flat soft brush, just carefully painting or wetting it right up to the edge of the sand dunes there without sort of brushing over it, because obviously you'll just wake up your watercolour and it will blend into the sky. So I'm just giving it a good soak so that again it gives me a lot longer to work on the sky area. So I'm starting at the top of the sky and I'm painting wet in wet. It's a nice sky, especially if you're a beginner here, because it's just a flat blue sky. I'm just going to get slightly lighter as I go towards the horizon, and as you saw there as well, I've got a very thin wash of diluted cadmium red as well to paint just at the top of the sand dunes and at the bottom of the horizon. So I'm working my way down here you can use the largest brush that you feel comfortable to use, and I've got my painting on a slight tilt as well, so the paint's running down, so it's helping me to paint this sky actually. And keep loading your brush as well, be generous with the paint. I've left a few little gaps there to create a little bit of atmosphere, but if you look at the photograph, that's just a sort of slightly graded sky, isn't it, coming down towards the horizon. I'm tilting here as well. You can see I've got quite a bit of excess paint there, so I'm just picking that up there with my brush as well, so I don't end up with any puddles that potentially could give me back runs later in the sky area. I'm adding the red now. What you want to make sure is your red is the same consistency as the blue. So you don't want it wetter. So if it's a little bit wetter, just take the excess off on the paper towel. Otherwise that red will run back into the blue and create another crinkly cauliflower background there. But if you have your painting on a tilt, that shouldn't happen. And I'm just being very careful just at the top of the sand dunes here, just to use water really, just to blend there so you don't get the red going over the edge or the top of the sand dunes. So I've allowed my painting to dry and it's time to paint the camels and the herdsmen there. So I've kind of gone right close in here because they're quite tiny, but I'm just going to keep the detail to the minimum. A little bit like my recent tutorial of painting people. Obviously I'm painting a little person here or sideways, but also painting these little camels here, keeping the shapes very simple. From a distance they read as camels, but up close they're almost abstract. So I'm just painting a little bit of colour on their saddles there, using a bit of the red. I'm mixing up the red, the yellow and the blue there just to create some darks. And on the herdsman I used a little bit of the ultramarine and a dash of red as well. I'm just sort of mixing up, just trying to vary the colours in a way here with the three primary colours. So as you see here, I've mixed up a little bit of yellow and painting this at the top of the saddles just to give a little bit of interest and brightness of colours because they look quite silhouetted as well. So it's just to get a bit of interest. So this is the blue and the red and the yellow here mixed up together. I'm putting a lighter dark on, or a sort of mid to dark tone, and then I'll paint a darker tone later. But this is, you could make up an orange, red and yellow and then add a touch of blue. So I'm just carefully with my size 6 brush painting the camels wet on dry. And then I'm going to add a little bit more blue to that colour as well and paint that in some sort of darker tonal areas here and there on the camels, damp into damp. Just take your time with this, paint one at a time and just work your way through, and you can see already they come to life. They're not perfect camels, but from a distance your mind just makes up all the information. It's just like painting the little people. But as I said earlier, there is a downloadable sketch if you want a little bit of help with the drawing. So I'm actually going to use that same dark brown colour and paint some cast shadow underneath the herdsman and the camels as well, just to really ground them so they don't look like they're floating. I've already got a little bit of shadow that I previously painted damp into damp on the first stage, but this really sort of draws attention now to the camels and herdsmen, and they are the stars of the show. So I'm using that dark as well, just to paint some footprints in the sand, markings here and there, just to create a little bit of texture, a little bit of interest. So I'm painting wet on dry here, some shadows on the sand dunes, and I have used a little bit, again mixing up the red and yellow together and adding a touch of blue, probably a little bit more blue to make that shadow colour, painting wet on dry using my size 10 brush. Almost think of these as abstract shapes, and remember, don't be afraid of the dark. As you saw there, I've diluted some of that colour as well, just to sort of pale it away, having some shadows a little bit darker than others there. So you really you're creating a sort of structure here. So take your time. Remember, you're just using those three colours, and you can just dilute down that dark brown colour that I mixed there. But I'm just painting here. It's a little bit of a softer shadow here. So I've painted on the dark, and I've got diluted my brush, taken the excess water off, and then softened. It's not unlike how I paint petals. And when I'm flower painting, it's the same sort of effect. You put down your wash, wet on dry, and then get a damp brush to blend so you don't get a hard edge. So I'm painting a really dark shadow colour here using my size 10 brush. So it'll be more of the ultramarine, a little red, and then the yellow there. Again, if you get green, add a little bit more red. And I'm just softening here with my damp brush. So I'm painting the shadow here on the right hand side, and mixing up, fresh paint here, starting with the ultramarine, add a touch of red as well to that colour there, and a little bit of the yellow, and just paint this shadow here on the sand dune. The darkest part here is on the left, and then you can wash your brush off, use a damp clean brush, and then soften the outside edge of that shadow. So you maintain the colour underneath. It's almost like a soft glaze there. So you've still got that sort of orangey red sand reflected through. I'm just sort of painting here this line, wet on dry. Again, softening with my damp brush to sort of get rid of the hard edge there. And it sort of divides these different sand dunes up. So I'm just painting a little bit more shadow here on the right hand side with my size 10 brush, wet on dry, sort of sweeping the brush down to create that sort of swept up look of the sand there, and creating a few sort of more marks, hoof prints or footprints in the sand here in the foreground, using that lovely dark brown. I've mixed up a very, very thin wash here, just to create a little bit more depth in the foreground, using a mix of the red and yellow for the orange colour, and then a touch of the blue. So I've allowed the painting to dry, and you can see I've got that thin glaze in the foreground there with some dark marks here and there again in the foreground. I'm returning to the stars of my show just to build up a little bit more darks and details here and there with a mixture of the blue, the red and the yellow, and I'll also use a little bit of white gouache for highlights also. It really brings this painting to life. If you don't have white gouache, you could use white watercolour paint, white acrylic, or even white acrylic ink, or some white gel pens as well. I know some of you have been using. So it really does bring this little painting to life. You only have to put little touches here and there. So don't be tempted to overdo it and paint too much detail. What I'm going to do now is paint a very thin wash and glaze over this foreground here using my size 10 brush with a mixture of the ultramarine and a touch of the red with a really small touch of yellow. But it's a very, very thin wash, and it's just to really unify everything here. And I'm also painting some darks, more darks and details here in the foreground. I'm just building up some of the darks here on the right hand side. You may not have to do this, but I felt my painting had dried quite pale here, not as dark as I wanted it to be. So I'm just used a mixture of the ultramarine with the red and yellow again, and just sort of building in this dark here and changing the sort of shape to sweep it along, almost to draw the eye in to where the camels are as well. On that line just behind them. I'm just painting a few more marks as well in the foreground, quite a sort of an orangey wash there, just to create a little bit more interest, and it'll create a little bit of depth as well in the foreground. So the painting has dried now, and I'd like to introduce a little bit more warmth to the sand. So I'm mixing up a puddle of sort of an orangey colour here. It's the red and yellow with a tiny touch of the blue, very similar to the colour that I used at the beginning of the tutorial. I just wanted to give a little bit more depth to the painting there. It dried a little bit yellow, so it's a little bit more red in that colour mixture. So I'm glazing this on, quite a thin wash, wet on dry here and then just lifting off some of the highlights as well, some of the lighter areas on the sand dunes. I'm just painting a dark wash in the corner here, damp into damp, just adding a little bit more red and brown with a touch of the yellow there to really sort of bring this forward to create depth in the painting. And just adding a few more sort of warm darks here and there, especially sort of leading the eye to the herdsman and the camels, and underneath the shadow colour as well, just to bring everything together. I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to paint a few sort of darks and details on the camels as well, using my size 6 brush with a lovely rich dark of the mix of the ultramarine, the red with a touch of yellow there. So I'm using a small round brush here, my size 4 brush, using the dark sort of brown colour there. Again, the ultramarine with the red and a little touch of the yellow, and painting in the rope here that connects them all together. And I really think it's a nice way to finish off this painting. So I've removed the washi tape here to reveal a nice white border. It gives me time to assess to see if I need to do any more as well. So for my first desert painting, I'm quite pleased with it actually, and I really hope it inspires you to maybe have a go at painting a desert painting using just 3 colours. Except I did use a little bit of blue, a phthalo blue in the sky and a little bit of white, but on the whole, just 3 colours, and it just simplifies everything. Thank you for all the patrons that actually suggested this in the poll, so I really hope you've enjoyed it as well. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And don't forget, if you'd like to share your work, you can do so on the members Facebook page. A link for the page can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for all your support on the memberships. I really appreciate it. Happy painting. Bye for now.